Hey y'all, this is the Christ Center Conversations podcast, and I'm Shelby Stanfill.
And I'm Kevin Stanfill. Each week, we come together and discuss the Book of Mormon, another testament of Jesus Christ.
We hope you enjoy listening to this week's episode.
Hey Shelby.
Hey Kevin.
How's it going?
It's going great.
That's good. Just here for the Book of Mormon podcast.
We are.
What episode is it?
46.
Episode 46. Man, what a number. So many episodes.
That is a lot of episodes.
And we are in 2nd Nephi, chapter 24. It's a momentous chapter. And
why is that?
Well, it's the prophecy of Israel triumphing over the world. Because, let's face it, right? We know that since, Moses, Israel has kind of been like that underdog, right? Kind of the oppressed. And their eventual destiny is to, have a king who reigns over the whole earth, and then they can rest. And I guess rest from oppression and hardship and just, that stuff.
Right.
But that kind of goes back to, in a way, I think it goes back to Adam and Eve, who, they obviously, they began in the Garden of Eden. They were in this perpetual state of rest, where everything temporal was given to them. But they couldn't progress there.
Right.
Either they didn't have the tools, they didn't have the knowledge, something, right? And that's when Lucifer, symbolized by the serpent, infiltrated the garden, tempted them, and caused them to fall.
Right.
Right. Which, I guess I could pick apart my statement there, and it's like, well, did Lucifer cause them to fall, or did their decisions cause them to fall? But we won't get in the nitty gritty of that. I think the reason that I bring it up is that since day one, man has been somewhat impacted and subject to the world, to the powers, or I guess to Lucifer, right here on the earth, because we've been physically separated from our Father in heaven, Jesus Christ. So all this time has gone by, and Isaiah in his day was, this was prophetic, because he did not see, I don't believe he saw the fall of Babylon. Maybe he did. I'm not exactly sure.
I'm pretty sure he did.
He did?
Right? Didn't he see our day?
Oh, okay. Excuse me. Well, of course he saw it. I'm just saying, in his, did he live to see the actual fall of Babylon?
Oh, was he literally there?
Right.
Oh, I don't know about that.
I'm not sure.
I was like, of course he saw our day. That's how we have all the writings.
I know, right? Okay, so I like where you went with that, because this is his vision, or his prophetic account of, I'll just read the heading of chapter 24. It says, Israel will be gathered and will enjoy millennial rest, which we've talked about a lot. If you've listened to our podcast thus far, you know all about the millennium. We've talked about it in depth. Lucifer was cast out of heaven for rebellion. That's something that we learn in this chapter. And Israel will triumph over Babylon, i.e. the world. And it's compared with Isaiah chapter 14 in the Old Testament. And, before we get into it, I do want to point out that this is another time, happens quite often, I found, that if you can look at the last verse of the previous chapter in 23, and it kind of segues real nice, and it gives you, I don't know if it's more, I don't know if it's absolutely necessary detail, but at the end of the last chapter, Isaiah is talking about Babylon, which is this great and powerful and beautiful civilization. And because of its great fall and destruction, no man will ever inhabit it again. And the wild beasts will kind of roam in and out of it. And in that last verse,
in chapter 23, second Nephi,
in that last verse of the previous chapter, the Lord says, "For I will destroy her," referring to Babylon, "speedily. Yea, for I will be merciful unto my people, but the wicked shall perish." So he adds that caveat of, I'm going to be merciful to my people, even though that all of this destruction is taking place. And I don't know. It likens it to Sodom and Gomorrah, but I think that's more of it's destroyed as Sodom and Gomorrah was, but there were no good people. There were no righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. We know that because in the Old Testament, the Lord's saying hey, if you can find X number of people who are righteous, then I'll spare the city. And they couldn't find any righteous people, right? I wonder if, with Babylon, how many good, righteous, or at least people who were, who were at least noble, were caught up in that destruction. And of course, they won't be delivered to hell, right? They'll be delivered up in the last day. They probably already have been, because it was before Christ's coming. So they're set. But my takeaway from that is that the Lord said, hey, this destruction is going to come upon Babylon. In our summation, it's the world. And we're living in the world right now. And so if the world is taken down, we can have some hope and assurance from the Lord that he's still going to be merciful unto his people, the righteous, the people who work hard. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to be affected by the great fall of the world.
Right.
Temporarily.
Of course. Yeah, I always thought, that's funny that you say that, because I always thought growing up as a little girl and into my teenage years, I was as long as I, keep my commitments, I will be saved. I won't have to endure all these so-called punishments for the wicked, right? That are only coming upon the wicked. How I thought it was. And then as I've gotten older, I've realized that that's not true, that I do have to endure maybe some of the punishments that do come, not because I'm wicked, but just because it's an effect of this temporal world. And the perfect example of that is, even if you know me, I do not like thunderstorms or tornadoes or anything. And we live in Texas, which is notorious for them. We live in the area where there's tornado warnings all the time. But that's an effect of the fallen world. That's an effect. Just because I'm righteous and keep my commandments doesn't mean that I don't have to endure a thunderstorm, and that can be said for pretty much anything, because it is an effect of being fallen. And it goes back to what you're saying in the beginning of Adam and Eve. It's because they fell that we might be and that we might have joy, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to have. How do we find the joy? Well, we find the joy because of the opposite of joy, the misery and the woe that's going on, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good point, because don't think you're exempt from anything. And I told Kevin this last night, and I think thunderstorms in my head, because there was a little bit of a thunderstorm last night. And I told him, we joke a lot. You guys know, we'll make little jokes and stuff in reference to the scriptures throughout our day. And I said, hey, babe, I said, when the millennium comes and Christ comes, you got to keep me calm during those thunderstorms because I'm going to be freaking out because I don't like them. But I know that they serve as a warning that, our Savior is coming again. Like this increase in natural disasters is definitely a sign of the coming of Christ. And if you don't think it is, then think again, because they keep increasing as years go on, and they're just going to get more and more and more. So, yeah.
Good insight. Yeah. And so that kind of, that brings us into the chapter today. How
long did it take us to get to the chapter?
Well, to be fair,
like 10 minutes.
Oh yeah, but don't worry, we've got plenty of time, and then we've got the whole millennium. So, where to begin? I guess we'll just begin in verse 1. Just so the reason that I looked back to the last chapter in the last verse is because it continues in that same vein. Verse 1, for the Lord will have mercy on Jacob, which is, the house of Jacob, synonymous with Israel, right? And will choose Israel and will and set them in their own land, and the strangers shall be joined with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. And that was pretty cool, because I thought to myself, I wrote, of course, that all followers of Christ will be, who are baptized and confirmed members of Christ Church in these last days, even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, will be adopted into the house of Israel, even if they have no actual Israelite blood, right? Mm. And so that's one thing. And then I also thought, these strangers in other lands could also, we'll continue. In verse 2, and the people shall take them and bring them to their place. And again, the people that it's referring to, I believe, is Israel, right? Yea, from far ends, or far unto the ends of the earth, and they shall return to their lands of promise. And the house of Israel shall possess them, and the land of the Lord shall be for servants and handmaids, and they shall take them captives unto whom they were captives, and they shall rule over their oppressors. So there's a lot of stuff going on there that's kind of contextual to the time, right? We can liken it to that day, but I think we've done that enough. How do we liken it to our day and to the last days?
Ow, I'm sorry. I hit my elbow on the table. I'm not going to lie. Your question, I got caught up in a thought that I wanted to say.
Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to read in the student manual from Isaiah's student manual, the Old Testament. It says, it specifically refers to verse 2 here, and it helped me understand it a little bit more. And it says that, I'm just going to read it. It says, the gathering process that restores Israel to her promised lands will be facilitated by other nations, which are the people who you were talking about.
Okay.
Who will assist in Israel's return from the ends of the earth. Then these other nations will espouse Israel's cause, and the captive, which is Israel, will become a ruler over her captors. So the favor, and it says, this favored condition will be fully realized in the glorious millennial peace enjoyed by the faithful who have truly conquered Babylon, or the world. In other words, as C.F. Keel or this other guy put it, Babylon falls that Israel may rise.
Okay.
So I don't think the other people were necessarily Israel. They were just
Yeah.
other nations. And I got caught up on that because I was trying to, and you asked a question about how it's like into our day, and my mind was somewhere else for a second.
Well, that's really perfect.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I can see better now how it's like into our day. Do you want to say anything else about it?
No, I just wanted to like clarify.
Yeah.
That.
No, I appreciate that. So the people is like they're other nations other than the Israelites.
Right, and they assist in Israel's return. So,
Right.
I mean, they are probably good people because they're bringing Israel to finally rise and the world will fall. And so Israel, who once was captive, becomes a ruler, which is very symbolic of Jesus Christ. Because when he came, it's a type of Christ. When Christ came into this world, he had literal lineage royalty. And he was born in a barn with animals. Like, that's not how a king is treated, right? But eventually he will be the ruler and the king of the nations, which we've talked about. So you were going to say something.
Well, it goes back to, so in 2 Nephi chapter 21, verse 14, we talked about this during the podcast in which we talked about this chapter, which probably was like 2 or 3 episodes ago. I'll read the verse. It says, "But they shall fly upon the shoulders of the Philistines toward the west." And they being like the Lord's people, the Israelites. Now, we should understand this to be interpreted as, the Philistines, which we're actually going to talk about a little bit later today, were the enemies or among the enemies of Israel in ancient times. And this was just an infidel nation to their west. And they constantly kind of went up to war against the Israelites and so on and so forth. We should interpret that as being that, in the last days that will, like, the Lord's righteous people will fly upon, or more aptly translated to like a bird of prey swooping down on them from above, right? Attacking them. A different interpretation has been that the Philistines, who are not a covenant people, will give aid to the Israelites. And so that, like, the children of the righteous, the hope of Israel, the youth today, will be upon their shoulders like hanging on to them, like to be carried by them. And so that's interesting, right? There could be that little dualistic nature in that prophecy, right?
Right.
The only reason that I bring that up is that, the Lord uses other nations, other people. He uses us all the time in ways that we don't really expect to complete his work. And we just have to be willing, and we have to be mindful of him. And if he can do that with people who are not even covenant people, then he can definitely do it with us. And we have faith that we can be a part of the work,
Yeah. I like it.
Hopefully all that made sense.
So where do we want to go next?
There are so many little things, but I definitely, I don't want to. One thing is that in that second verse, the land of the Lord shall be for servants and handmaids. I kind of thought about it where, once we possess a land, like once the church gets some land, what do they do with it?
I don't know.
Well, we build temples on it.
Yeah, but we have land where there's nothing on it.
Well, yeah, not yet. There's going to be...
I would have said we do various things with it.
Yeah, we do. We build cities, we build temples, but it's all to build up Zion.
Right.
Okay. And so, this idea of the land of the Lord shall be for servants and handmaids, people who assist one another and assist others. I see that as like a prophecy of, the temple work to be done up until the last day, or up until the millennium and into the millennium. So I just wanted to throw that over there. So yeah.
Good insight.
Verse 3, just kind of talking about the Lord giving rest to his people. And
isn't like verses 3 through like a lot of these verses are talking about the
fall of Babylon.
Yeah, the fall of Babylon.
Like the literal fall of Babylon.
Or like it is synonymous with Lucifer as well.
Pardon my blender bottle
and the
rattle.
millennium. Oh, I didn't even notice.
So yeah, we can jump there. Starting in verse 4, it talks about this proverb against the king of Babylon, who we compare, or Isaiah compares the king of Babylon with Lucifer in these verses. So Shelby, how do you want to start that off?
Well, I mean, I did a really simple study of this chapter, and Kevin did a very in-depth study of this chapter, which will make a good balance for this discussion. But if I could, I mean, I don't have specific insights to like single verses like you do.
Yeah.
But what I did find interesting was the comparison of Babylon to Lucifer. And it really goes past the verses that we're talking about. It's really more in like verses 12 on. But when I was reading, there was, I can't remember if it was in the Book of Mormon or the Old Testament student manual, where it said Lucifer, his name was symbolic of, let me find it. It meant light bearer, Lucifer. That's what that means. And it says, I'm just going to read it. It says the only place, this is a fun fact, the only places in the Bible and the Book of Mormon where the name Lucifer is used are Isaiah 14:12 and 2 Nephi 24:12. In the Doctrine and Covenant 76, 25 through 28, we learn that Lucifer means light bearer, was the premortal name of Satan. Because of his rebellion against God, he fell from his position of authority in the presence of God and was called perdition, which means destruction. And it says, Isaiah used the story of Lucifer's pride and his fall from heaven to typify the king of Babylon's ambitions and eventual downfall. And then I'm going to read one more thing. It says, Isaiah's description of Babylon and her rulers are also a type and shadow of when Satan will be bound and will have no power over the nations during the millennium. So I thought that was very interesting. I think I knew at some point that Lucifer's name did signify light bearer, but then, he was called perdition and that meant destruction once he fell. And that's really, when I was reading this, it did make sense when I was reading it. I didn't necessarily have to go to the student manual this time because I know the story of Lucifer falling. Yeah. And so it was very easy to relate that to Babylon and see, oh, okay, because of Babylon's pride, like Satan had pride, here comes the fall and everything that comes with it, right? And those are what all those verses, talk about, or maybe more specifics and more insight that you might have on those verses. So.
Oh, for sure. So, just like the king of Babylon, the ruler of this powerful earthly nation, Lucifer, the devil,
Mm-hmm.
he also has a lot of power and influence over this world.
Yeah.
And so to think that there's a day coming in which his influence will be completely taken away is pretty outstanding, right? It's remarkable. And so we can think of that as being, imagine, the United States is an incredibly powerful entity in the world. Imagine if it was brought low to the point where it had no influence at all, right? That would be pretty nuts, right? It would change the world. Yeah. It would change the entire dynamic of the world. So in verse 5, the Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked, again, the rod of an oppressor. In verse 6, he, referring to Babylon or Lucifer, he who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke. And that continual stroke, all the way from Adam and Eve to when the Lord comes again, right? Just continual, just beating us over the head, right? He that ruled the nations in anger is persecuted, and none hindereth. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet, and they break forth into singing. So that kind of talks about that millennial rest.
Yeah.
Which in verse 9 and 10, it talks about how imagine these other earthly nations and rulers looking at Babylon, and they're like, man, Babylon's become as us, like low and brought low and near destruction. And that's how the nations of the earth kind of look to Lucifer, right? It's like Lucifer's been brought so low and so powerless, just like Babylon was brought low and made powerless. Mm-hmm. In verse 12, how it cites Lucifer's name, like you were talking about.
Right.
This is kind of the statement made by these other earthly rulers. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? Art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? For thou hast said in thy heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit.
So okay. In 14, this is him expressing his desires, like his pride, right?
Right.
But it says, I will be like the Most High. And I can only assume that means Heavenly Father.
Right.
Which is very interesting because this gives us insight into the plan of salvation, because Satan did want to become like Heavenly Father.
Yeah.
Right? And we see that right there. But the way that he went about it was not right. And it says, and there's insight from President Ezra Taft Benson. He says, in the pre-earthly council, Lucifer placed his proposal in competition with the Father's plan as advocated by Jesus Christ. He wished to be honored above all others. In short, his prideful desire was to dethrone God. So maybe I'm wrong. He wanted to dethrone God. So maybe I just learned something, which is what this podcast is for, right?
Yeah. So what do you mean you learned something?
Because I thought that in verse 14 in 2 Nephi 24, he says, I will be like the Most High. Well, I guess, and then we read from President Benson, Ezra Taft Benson, that he says, in short, his prideful desire was to dethrone God. And I guess it was to dethrone him in order to become like him.
Right. I mean,
So,
there's a difference between wanting to be or become like God,
right,
in the progression through the covenant path and faith in Jesus Christ and obedience and sacrifice.
He wanted to get there real quick.
He wanted to have everyone worship him and receive glory, but not do any of the work to do it.
Interesting. I don't know if anybody else listening learned something from that, but I did. So thank you.
Well, that's good. Like you said, that's what the podcast is about.
Yeah.
So, and in verse 6, referring to Lucifer, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, and made the world as a wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof, and opened not the house of his prisoners? And that's also what was going on with Babylon, right? It's like, how is it that, I just keep saying it, but it's just this unbelievable thing, right? That such a powerful entity is made so inconsequential. And it talks about in the student manual somewhere about how it's crazy that, I mean, even the most wicked dictators of the earth will at least receive the celestial kingdom.
Oh, I have the quote.
Yeah, go for it.
It's in relation to verses 18 and 19, I'm pretty sure, because it's talking about like the death or like the grave. Maybe we should read that really quick. It says, well, yeah, 18. Why don't you read 18? I have Isaiah. Why don't you read 18 and 19 and 2 Nephi 24?
Okay. Verse 18, all the kings of the nations, yea, all of them lie in glory, every one of them in his own house. But thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch, and the remnant of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet.
Okay, so now I have the quote, so we can understand that. It says, in still another example of Isaiah's beautiful dualism, even the kings of the world lie in their tombs, house, in respect. So that then it quotes 18 and 19. But Babylon's king was to be cast aside and trodden underfoot. This reward was literally visited upon the city of the Chaldees, and through Nebuchadnezzar was certainly buried in a great splendor. There is no grave found for him today in the ruins of Babylon. I thought that was interesting. Think for a moment of Satan's grave. Never having received a body, he shall never have a tomb or momentum of any kind. Yeah, monument. Sorry, not. I knew that sounded weird. Monument of any kind. Though he was king and ruler of a great worldwide and history-wide empire of spiritual Babylon. This is what you were talking about. No wonder the kings of the earth, who, through wicked immortality, could still inherit the celestial kingdom, would marvel at his demise.
And that's what I've been trying to like hammer home at, where I keep on talking about these other kings, these other nations, looking at Babylon or looking at Lucifer. But of course, and whose quote is that? Or is that just...
This is...
Is it just the manual?
I think it's just the manual, yeah.
So some inspired counsel was able to succinctly put that together, where I've been trying to go at this for like 30 minutes. Right? So that's what I was trying to get at. What else do you want to...
Nothing. I just wanted to share that quote. I think I'm the quote finder on this podcast. That should be my nickname.
Well, it's what I've tried to do in my studies is I've tried to do I go and look at the student manual.
Yeah.
But I try not to always link it in to quote it, because I want,
you want to learn.
I want to learn and I want to say it in my words, not always someone else's words.
Gotcha.
But no, I appreciate you like coming in with those hitters.
Do you want to talk about how Israel triumphs and how the Palestinian and all that comes into play?
Well, yeah. So that's verse 24 and onward, right?
Right.
So, yeah, once Lucifer is bound, and the Lord assists Israel in its rightful place on the earth, not oppressed. The enemies of Israel will kind of depart, will be, in fact, they'll be subject to Israel in a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I mean, I don't know if there's something specific that you wanted to point out, but yeah, I mean, verses 24 through 28 or 27 is kind of just this, the Lord pointing out and like, I don't know, just, it's very much the first shall be last. The last shall be first, kind of like paradox stuff. And then, of course, the Lord is at the center of it with his hand being stretched out upon all nations. No one can undo what he does and stuff like that. What did you want to point out?
Well, once again, I really gained insight in the student manual to this. It just helps me understand
Sure.
a lot of things. And this is, I think, well, in 24 through 27, we were talking about, the summary that it gives is that Assyria was like Babylon. And it says, in addition to his use of Babylonian Empire as a symbol of spiritual Babylon, Isaiah also sketches the demise of the great Assyrian Empire, which in the days of blah, 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 meant crushing defeat upon the hills of Jerusalem. So it says, Assyria also served as a type of the world. In like manner will all evil nations feel the hand of God's judgments. And then in the further verses in 28 through 32, it says that these verses reveal the judgment of destruction, which Isaiah lived to witness. Against Philistia. Okay, well, there's an answer to our question in the beginning. The Philistines were actually longtime enemies of Israel. And the warfare between the two people had gone on for a very long time. And I'm quoting the thing here. But it says they controlled parts of the Holy Land's coastal regions through their power waned considerably from the time of David on. And then it says in Roman times, this gives a lot of context. So it says in Roman times, the Holy Land was known as Judea until the Jewish revolt. And then it gives a time frame, after which the Emperor Hadrian changed the name to Syria, Palestina, to show the Jews that they had no claim there any longer. And it says the King James Version used the Latin form and called it Palestina. But what is meant is the Philistines, not Palestine, as the terms are used today. And so I just thought it was interesting because as it goes on, it says, in like manner will Zion be established while all her enemies, Babylon, Assyria, Philistia, and so on, will be powerless to make it otherwise, but they will fall. So it was also like another type of Babylon here in the last couple of verses, using Assyria as a type.
If you know a little bit about current day geography and
like over in the Holy Land?
Yeah, like geopolitics.
Yeah.
That gives a little bit of insight into why, like, as an American, sometimes like I don't understand why Israel, like the nation of Israel and Palestine are so, and Syria and Iran are so at odds with one another. Like it's just been going on since
centuries.
Yeah.
Dude.
Well,
yeah, sorry, I like yelled there. It's been going on forever. I mean, we were reading about it.
I mean, so Palestine, it's often talked about like how like Palestinians today, they think they have this claim, and then the Israelis, they think they have a different claim, and like there are certain beliefs that there is no Palestine and that makes sense because it was originally called Judah or Judea.
And then it was when they conquered the Holy Land, in Roman times, that's when they changed it to Syria, Palestina, to show the Jews they no longer had claim. So that's interesting. So it's cool to see the context and understand that. But I do want to say right here, it says, in spite of the hatred of the Philistines and their persecution of Israel, the Lord's people were established in the land. In like manner, Zion will be established, like I said earlier. So that's where the comparison comes in. That's why I wanted to say that in the first place, because it does compare to eventually everything everything will be put in its rightful place and rightful order. And oh my goodness, I just thought of this. God is a God of order. So there's a lot of things out of order here on earth. And I'm sure he's just waiting to come and put it into order.
Right.
Anyway.
And unfortunately, those ancient traditions of fathers, those old hatreds, really, there's no way to dispel those without the atonement of Jesus Christ taking effect. Right? I mean, people have something against their brother or sister or their parents, and they never get over it just in their life. Imagine something that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years. There's nothing except a God dying for us to make things right. Right.
Very true.
So I did want to point out that in verse 28, this is just a little contextual thing, because the name Ahaz comes back up, and that's what Isaiah does from time to time is he'll put down the death of somebody or the reign of somebody to kind of give a timestamp, if you will. So in verse 28, it timestamps it, and you can definitely follow through to like the student manual. It basically talks about actually you already said stuff about that. And 30 through 32, to kind of just to take this home, these I wrote down that these are kind of like the qualities of life in the millennium and the establishment of Zion. And I just wanted to read it.
Okay.
So in verse 30, and the firstborn of the poor shall feed, and the needy shall lie down in safety. And I will kill thy root with famine, and he shall slay thy remnant. Howl, O gate, cry, O city, thou whole Palestina art dissolved. For there shall come from the north a smoke, and none shall be alone in his appointed times. What shall then answer the messengers of the nations? That the Lord hath founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall trust in it. So obviously there's a lot going on. There's a lot of poetic language, right? But I would invite you, Shelby, and to listeners to read those verses and study and kind of discern what exactly that means for us. What are we trying to accomplish? Like what's our end state as a people in the kingdom of God? Obviously it talks about Palestina being dissolved. Whenever it talks about howling at the gates, I feel like it's referring to, an assault, right? Like soldiers coming into a city, right? And I just wanted to kind of present that as an additional piece of imagery. And then something in verse 31 that I really caught hold of, it says, there shall come from the north a smoke. Now,
You mean 31?
what did I say?
I think you said 30.
I meant to say 31. There's that little line, and it's like, again, there's something, every single thing is important, right? In Hebrew text, directions can be symbolic. So the eastward it like denotes God. It denotes something coming from God.
Yeah.
And if you're facing east, your right hand would be to the south, right? Take my word for it. If you're facing east, your right hand is to the south, your left hand is to the north, and your back is to the west.
Okay.
Okay. So the south it denotes your covenant hand, things that are important to God, right? Important to you and your relationship with God. On the left hand are things that are not covenant related, things that are perhaps, I don't want to say of no worth, not sure.
North.
Yeah, on the north.
That's where the smoke comes from.
And yet that's where the smoke comes from, which smoke is also, that suggests the presence of God, right? A cloud.
Okay.
So, and what's to the north of Palestine?
I don't know.
I don't know.
To know.
I don't know.
Oh.
I'm just, I mean, well,
well, you're
obviously,
me
well, yeah,
like
I mean,
you were teaching me.
I don't know. I don't know. I would like to, I mean, immediately to the north is kind of like Ephraim, right? Like Israel, like the northern kingdom of Israel. Maybe that had, I'm making suggestions because we don't really know what it means. I mean, I guess we could go to outside sources to figure it out or to get interpretations, but it's just interesting. And then, of course, like Syria is to the far north of Israel in these ancient times. But yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to like confound you or anything, and but I'm just trying to just throw out some thoughts.
Gotcha. Well, I appreciate them.
Well, I'm sure hopefully somebody will have a little bit of insight there for us. But so this, I'm really glad that this is the last Isaiah chapter, at least for the time being. There's another one coming up in in chapter 27 that is compared with Isaiah, but it's still, I've read that one, and it's definitely more straightforward. Luckily, Nephi went in and he gave a lot of additional clarification to it. And so next week, we're in chapter 25, where Nephi glories in plainness. Apparently, all of this was super plain and simple to Nephi. So, Shelby, any takeaways? Any concluding thoughts?
Nope. I said it all. At least I think I did. I'm good. I'm excited to move on though.
All right, cool. Well, we definitely appreciate the Spirit being with us through these last several months to teach us and give us more insight. Although it's interesting that even though I don't know everything in the Isaiah chapters, I still have a testimony of it. I have a testimony that it's all true.
Right.
Because the Spirit has taught me and confirmed in my mind, in my heart, that they are true, that they'll be understood when we need to understand them. And there is a reason that Shelby and I are reading them at this time in our lives and going so deep into them. You know, if the Lord wanted us to do this 10 years ago, then that's when we would have done it. So there's a reason, a rhyme and reason.
There's a time and a place for everything.
Yeah.
And there's a time and a place for this, and also for those listening. So anyway, we love you guys. We will be back with you next week on episode 47. Is that right?
That's right.
Wow. And then, yeah, we'll be in 2 Nephi 25.
All right,
so
y'all.
We'll hear from y'all. Any insights you might have, please message us. And we'll see you guys next time.
All right, y'all. Bye-bye. We hope you're enjoying the Christ-Centered Conversations podcast featuring the Book of Mormon.
If you have any suggestions for the show, please message us on Facebook at Kevin or Shelby Stanfill.
We also invite you to visit churchofjesuschrist.org for more information on the Book of Mormon and the restored gospel of Jesus Christ.